Welcome to Living the Next Chapter. I'm happy to have on with me today. Rachel Dickinson is on, and she is coming on to talk about her book. She's written many books in the past, and she's been a travel writer. She's written for newspapers, but her most recent book is a series of essays in and around the tragic loss of her son, Jack, who died at 17 years of age. He ended his own life. And Rachel writes as a mom who's lost a son. And this, her latest book, The Loneliest Places, is a way for her to express and write through her grief. And we get into a lot about her backstory and her author journey in this episode. And what I'm going to do actually is have Rachel come back and be a part of the Dad Space podcast. And we're going to go deeper into the story around Jack, and from a parent's point of view, share the journey of what she's been through as a mom and what her family has been through and her fond thoughts of Jack. And it's a story that requires more than just one episode. So that episode will be recorded in the future, and we will link to it. So if you're listening to this episode of Living the Next Chapter, you will find a link to this episode on Dad Space once it's recorded and released. But for now, I wanted to share a little bit of the journey of becoming an author and how Rachel went from walking into an editor's office and saying, I want to be one of your writers, to now having over 7 books out and being a published author. An interesting journey with Rachel. And again, stay tuned for an episode of Dad Space, our other podcast. And Rachel's going to come on and talk a little bit more about her son and what happened there and how the family is coping. So thank you for being part of the podcast. Here's a little snippet from the episode, and then we'll jump right in. Thanks for listening.
I thought about who my audience was, and you always need to think about that when you're writing. And for me, my audience was myself. And I knew I couldn't really write about why Jack did what he did. And I couldn't really write about my other family members without feeling like I was writing a story that was not mine to tell. They get to write their own stories about how they felt. So I knew I was writing my own story for me. And as I went along, I thought, well, maybe this will help other people who are going through this kind of deep, deep grief. And so each essay is just about whatever I was thinking about at that moment.
Okay, welcome to Living the Next Chapter. I have an amazing author with me today. We're going to be talking about her journey as an author, as a mom. There's going to be a lot of great stuff that we cover today in the podcast. So happy that we can make this happen today. We both don't like snow, so we have that in common. And it's great to have my guest here with me today. Rachel Dickinson is with me. Rachel, welcome to the podcast. Very pleased and honored to have you on today. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for inviting me, Dave. I really appreciate it.
I love meeting with an author who has a message, who has a story to share, and people to help. And you do all of those things, which is incredible. Take me back in time, Rachel. Let's talk a little bit about your history as an author, and kind of when did you know in your heart that you were an author?
I started writing in about 2000, the year 2000, and I started writing for my local newspaper I went into the editor's office of the paper and I said, I want to write a column. And after he got done laughing at me, he said, well, what would you write about? And I live in this little teeny tiny village within this county that the paper encompassed. I said, well, and I pulled an index card out of my pocket and it said, I'd write about corn. I'd write about daily walks. And I had this list of about 10 things. And he said, okay, just hand one in. We'll go from there. And that started kind of a 5-year run in the paper where it went from being buried somewhere in the paper to being on, let's see, the opinion page, and with it was advertised on Mondays above the fold, above the masthead. And I said to him, "Wow, I can't believe your circulation has really jumped, probably on Mondays." He said, "Yeah, but it might be because that's when we put the circulars in as well." So there we go. That was my illustrious start at the paper. But that is where I learned how to write an essay of about 500 words. So, and when I looked back on those, a third of them were really good, a third were terrible, and then there was that middle third to work on. But I wrote every single week, didn't matter where I was, how I felt. I made sure the paper had a column from me. So that's where I learned about deadlines and that it was important to meet them.
So for an author that doesn't have a deadline over their head as they're writing, what is the advantage to having a deadline for a paper for you as an author?
Well, I think anyone who works on a newspaper understands deadlines and learns how to write fast. That's what a deadline does. It means you don't have, you can spend 6 days thinking about what you're going to write, but if you don't have something ready to turn in at 8:00 in the morning on that seventh day, you're not meeting your obligation to the readers. And that's how I always approached it. So I would spend a lot of time. I finally realized I wrote a lot of the piece in my head as I was walking around town or whatever. And so it was kind of pre-written, and I could sit down and write a really pretty good first draft, just, in one sitting. And then I would go back and fuss with it a bit. But so that deadline taught me how to write fast.
Okay, so what was your earliest memory of a connection between yourself as a writer and a reader responding to you? Take me back to that point in time, and people are actually reading what I'm writing. How did that feel for you?
Well, it was really pretty interesting because they ran a picture with the column. So I would go into the store and people would come up to me and they had recognized me from the picture, and they would talk to me about what I had written that day or a column I wrote, a month ago. And honestly, until about last year, I did that for 5 years. So that's 17 years ago, I stopped writing that column. And until about 5 years ago, I had people come up to me several times a year, after I had stopped that column and saying, "Oh, I wish you would, continue to write the column." And I said, "Well, I'm writing books now and doing other things. And, so you can find my books online if you're that interested."
Yeah.
No, but I felt very, as a new writer, I felt kind of embarrassed at first that people were noticing. And then I felt good about it. I felt like, okay, this is really speaking to my local community. So that was fun.
Okay, so take me through the leap from writing for a newspaper weekly to writing your first book. Was that a really hard leap for you to make that change?
Well, there was a step in between.
Okay.
As I was writing that column, I decided, I don't know how this happened, but I decided I wanted to be a travel writer. So there was a conference that was being held in downstate New York, probably 3 hours from where I live. And someone had pointed it out to me, and I applied, basically having no clips, which is your written work, except for these columns. So I sent in several of these columns and I applied. And at the last minute, I was accepted. And I'm sure it's because someone dropped out, which is fine. So I made my way there, and there were 30 other writers there, and there were 15 editors from top magazines. At the time, they were magazines. Like from National Geographic Traveler, let's see, Audubon.
Wow.
was, several others were there. And part of what we did was we met one-on-one with these editors. And it was really scary proposition to me. So that first night, I'm kind of sitting in the bar in this little estate where we were meeting. And I was listening to how other writers talk to each other. And I thought, oh my God, they're all identifying themselves as having all this expertise in various subjects, soft adventure, or I write about spas, or I write about luxury travel. And I'm thinking, oh my God, I don't do any of that. So when someone asked me, I had to come up with something. And I said, I write about birds and birding. I don't know where I got that from, except my husband was the editor of a bird magazine. So I'd been around birds and birding. I'd never really birded much or had traveled for birding, but I thought, oh, this would be a great niche. No one is going to say this. And that indeed was true. So I got my first big assignment from saying I write about birds and birding. I did meet with one of the editors was from Travel and Leisure, and I remember was quaking in my boots going in to talk to her. And I sat down and I said, I write about birds and birding. She said, ugh, I hate birds. I said, okay, we've got nothing to talk about. So I walked away from that one. So that's what you could run in when you decide that you have a niche.
Yeah.
But that really started my whole journey into writing for big markets or bigger markets. I think I had woken up one day and said, now, why am I writing for like a penny a word when I could be writing for $1 a word? And that's what pushed me toward the travel writing. Plus, I've been to some amazing places because I was viewed as a travel writer. People want you to go places and write about these amazing places. So it got me on these kind of these really nice cruises, small ship cruises by National Geographic expeditions in Lindblad. And so I remember one I loved was circumnavigating Great Britain.
Oh, wow.
In one of these ships looking at the birds. Another one was going to Siberia and crossing from Nome, Alaska, and going down the coast of Kamchatka Peninsula looking at the birds. So it really has taken me some interesting places.
Wow. All that from that initial conversation led you around the world. That's amazing.
Exactly. Everyone has this little spark point. That was mine, I guess. So then I decided I wanted to write a book, and my husband was an editor, but he was also an author at the time, and he was writing books, and he was also and is a falconer. And so this was something brand new to my world. So he came to the marriage when his falconry was kind of in remission. And I didn't know he was a falconer. And one day he came home with this little kestrel, which is the smallest falcon in North America. And he said, oh my God, I've got to get my license renewed. I have to build a muse. I have to do this and that. And I just looked at him. I said, what are you talking about? And he said, well, I'm a falconer. So that began this whole journey into a world that was so foreign to me. And I thought, wow, I really want to learn more about it, kind of as a way to learn more about my husband, I think.
Yeah.
And I knew that I just couldn't go into the whole depth of what being a falconer meant with my husband. So I got in touch with the country's most hardcore falconer that my husband knew of. So it's a guy who lives in Utah, and he has a cabin in Wyoming, and he spends, at least more than half the year in Wyoming just hunting with these falconry birds. So I called him up, said, look, I'm interested in maybe writing a book. Can I come out and watch what you do and ride around and interview you? And he was more than happy to let me do that. So I wrote a proposal, found an agent by the strength of the proposal, and then got a publishing company to Houghton Mifflin, actually, to say they would publish this book. So I had a couple of years to write it, and that was my first book for adults called Falconer on the Edge, and it was a biography of this falconer and of his birds and of the prey species that they hunted and of a landscape that was changing kind of radically because of natural gas exploration. So it was a way to really do this kind of environmental book as well as to examine this really hardcore subculture of hunting, really.
Nice. So for a new author that's listening to our conversation, what would you, now that you've looked back over the years and you've written many books, anything that you would go back to book one and go, I'd like to tweak a little bit of this, like maybe your approach or how you wrote? Is there anything you've learned over the years that you might would love to apply to that book? Are you happy with it the way it is?
That book I'm really happy with.
Good.
For the most part. Sure, there are things you can tweak, but it took me a really long time to figure out the structure. And most authors have a problem with something, and that is my problem. And finding the structure of a book for me takes a lot of time and a lot of index cards and shuffling of index cards and writing timelines out to try to think of now, how am I going to present this story? So I do all of this research and I'm still searching for structure. I read a lot of books that I think, oh, that might be a good structure. And then I try to figure out exactly what the author did and how we got to the various points in the story. And at the end of the day, with Falconer on the Edge, I decided I would follow this guy through a hunting season, which started in, I don't even remember. I think it was August and ended sometime in the winter. So I just spent all this time in Wyoming riding around in a truck with a tape recorder on. And this guy, Steve Chingren, happened to be an amazing raconteur. I mean, he just talked and talked. He'd say something and I said, oh my God, don't write that. That'll kill my mother. Now, if he said it 3 times, I figured he wants me to write this. Yeah. I'm sorry. I'm sorry, Mrs. Chingren. I'm not trying to kill you.
I love it.
So I would write it anyway. So once I found that structure of kind of, going through a season and following him through this, first you start in this kind of the summer and the autumn and you go to the winter and the things that happens along the way with his birds. Does he lose a bird? Does a bird get killed? What's it like when a bird kills a sage grouse, which is their prey? And then just riding around that whole area, looking at natural gas wells and what it's doing to these towns that were nearby. These man camps would spring up for all the people who were working in the kind of oil fields, what it was doing to migration of pronghorn antelope. And,
wow.
So I really dove into it and I like what I did. I'm pretty happy with that one.
That's great. And to write your first book is a huge task for anyone, and then to look back and be proud of that. That's a great sign.
Yeah.
So you've written over the years. How many books are you up to right now?
I think this is my 7th. My latest is my 7th. I wrote 3 or 4 books that were geared toward middle school age kids. For a couple of years, I wrote, kind of I think it was like a monthly piece for the Christian Science Monitor. They had something called the Kids Page. And so when I was writing these pieces, I'd think, okay, what would a 10-year-old boy, I don't know why I always said that to myself, what would a 10-year-old boy want to read about? And I wrote, probably 36 of those columns.
Nice.
And so I got contacted by a publisher that did a lot of middle grade books. Excuse me. And this publisher said, "Oh, would you be interested in writing a couple of books in this series we're going to start that looks at the history and science of something and contains like 20 activities?" And I said, "Sure, right up my alley. I really liked history, and I got a degree in geology. So I felt like, okay, I can do this. And I can write like that 10-year-old boy, no problem." And so I enjoyed doing those books, particularly the first one, which was, I never remember the titles, but it was, I think, A Guide to Navigation, The History and Science of Finding Your Way. Wow. And I thought, oh, piece of cake, I just find a book written for adults on all of these different ways, people navigate through the world, geographically navigate. There is no one book like that. So for each chapter that I mapped out, I had to read, 3 or 4 books to get enough information. So I really learned, don't assume something's going to be easy just because you like the idea of the assignment. But it turned out to be a great book. And then I did one on pioneers and one on Romans, the history of Rome. So, and those have turned out to be the books that have actually really paid off in the end. And I hate to say, particularly during COVID, people were looking for things for kids to do at home. And these all have activities. I always get royalty checks from them. I have come to depend on them.
Nice. It's nice. Yeah. And I love when those checks come in. And that's just kind of nice to have that income that just lasts and lasts.
Yes. It's like, ooh, surprise, yet not surprise. Yeah. I feel really good about it.
Excellent. That's a great investment in your future as an author. Now, we connected over your most recent book, and I'm so happy to hear the background to your writings because that helps kind of set the stage for us. We're going to have a deeper conversation about the contents of your most recent book in another podcast coming up called Dad Space. But in here, I really want to focus in on why we connected. And that is for your most recent book. There's an amazing story behind this. There's so much to unpack. And that's, again, why I love to kind of do that over on Dad Space. But I would love to kind of hear your thoughts on your most recent book and who it's written for, and maybe a little bit of the surroundings around what you've written most recently.
Okay.
It means a lot to me as a parent as well.
Okay. Yeah, sure. The most recent one was published by an imprint of Cornell University Press, and it just came out in October of 2022. And it's called I always have to look at the title once again, The Loneliest Places, Lost Grief, and the Long Journey Home. A decade ago, my 17-year-old son died by suicide, and that tossed my whole family. He had three sisters and 2 parents. It tossed us all into this swirl of chaos and depression and, this feeling that we couldn't go on. It was just a horrible experience, and I wish it upon no one. But we all had our various breakdowns. Literally, it felt like we did kind of a tag team breakdown. One kid would fall apart and crawl their way out of the bag of depression, and someone else would go in, and it was really quite awful. So one thing I turned to was writing. And that came after 2 years of sitting in a chair and just drinking too much, I'm sure, and watching a whole lot of British police procedurals. And I think I like the British one because there's always this kind of flawed detective at the center. And I could so relate to this detective who was wounded in some way, and they're trying to sort things out in addition to solving crimes. So I felt a total parallel to that. Like I was trying to sort myself out while trying to figure out why Jack did this to himself. So those British detectives and I had a lot of a lot in common.
Yeah.
But during those years, I don't remember how we ate. I don't remember any of the logistics of everyday life. I just remember sitting in this chair. And yep, I know people ate. I know things happened, but I basically didn't leave the house except when I traveled. I also, before Jack died, I had accepted an assignment to go to the Falkland Islands, and there were lots of logistics to set up. And that started in November. Jack died in February, and I was slated to go in March or beginning of April. And I decided I was going to go. And people in my family, it was divided. Half thought I was just crazy to go, and the other half thought she needs to get away from here. So I left, and the second I got on the plane, I felt this big relief, this big release of all of this grief that had just been kind of keeping me wrapped up in a bubble. Because I realized no one would know me where I was going.
Yeah.
I could be whoever I wanted to be.
Yeah.
I had a job to do, and it turned out I was going to a landscape that I just loved.
Yeah.
It was this real, kind of barren looking landscape, a lot of different birds, including penguins, several species of penguins, and elephant seals and sea lions. And so it was something that was so foreign to where I lived. And I remember at one point standing in the middle of this kind of field and looking around and hearing the waves crashing and just thinking, my mother would have really hated it here because there was not a tree in sight. So it's funny, the things that, connect you to home sometimes. And this was the lack of trees. So, but I did this assignment, which meant I had to go. I was talking to people who had been in the Falkland Islands 30 years earlier when the Brits came to defend the islands from the Argentinians who had invaded. So Falkland Islands has 2,000 people in it and, 1 million sheep, basically. But at that point in 1982, Argentina was having a tough time under this dictator. And so he decided, well, let's just kind of divert people's attention. And he decided that they would invade the Falklands and relieve them from the oppression of the British, who they had been under for 200 years. Now, the Falkland Islanders didn't know that they needed to be relieved from the oppressors, which they'd been a British protectorate for hundreds of years. But Argentina had always claimed the Falkland Islands as their own, and in fact called them Las Malvinas. So the Argentine army shows up, including a lot of conscripts, just these young kids who were drafted to go and fight this war against the British. The British sent these warships and, just a really highly trained personnel. And it was basically a rout, but it took 80 days. Something around there. And so the people who were there just were mystified and horrified and felt terrorized by Argentina. They were told they had to drive on the other side of the road. They were told they had to speak only Spanish. All of these things that just, why us? Why now?
Yeah.
So when I was talking to these people who were showing me around the place, those who had been there just would get this look on their face and just almost like a distant look and you could tell they were putting themselves right back there. And the Argentines had salted landmines everywhere and not kept track of where they were. So this became a real problem. for the Brits and for the Falkland Islanders who lived there, because they didn't know where the landmines were.
Mm-hmm.
So when the Brits finally won, the Argentines left, and they left behind a cemetery filled with dead soldiers, basically. Wow. And it was really sad. And these terrorized Falkland Islanders, who to this day, when they talk about it or during one of these anniversary events, you can tell they're put right back there. And when I was looking at them, I realized I was kind of looking at myself, like they were right in the throes of this PTSD or PTSS that came right back. And I was like right in the beginning of mine. And so I found myself staring at a mirror often. And that was a very eerie feeling.
So was the book in process of being written at that point, or did you write it later?
No.
Okay.
I wrote, I wrote that as an assignment for Men's Journal or something. I don't know. And I think I wrote for a couple of places at that point. But I realized that I felt like I couldn't write about Jack. I couldn't figure out how to do it. So like on year 3, I think I spent the whole year writing a year of really bad poetry that no one will ever read because it's so bad. But it was a way to get stuff out on paper. I started writing essays probably around year 4 or 5. And the only essay writing I had done were these columns for the local paper. And so I had to really learn about the form. And so I read a lot of essays and just tried to figure out how to do it on my own. When I had a friend who was an editor at Cornell Press, and he'd been bugging me to write something for him since he had been reading those columns in the local paper. And he said to me, "What are you working on?" And I told him just this collection of essays about trying to make it through after Jack's death. And he said, "Let me see him." And so that started me having to write in earnest, because he said, "We want them, we'll publish them, but you need X amount. We want to fill X amount of pages." So I really knuckled down and really did it.
So this is a great lead up to our conversation that's going to happen on Dad Space. And I really want to kind of go deeper on the book in that podcast as well. From your point of view, as we close off this part of our conversation, how do you attempt a topic that's so deep and meaningful and personal? How do you write?
What I did, I thought about who my audience was, and you always need to think about that when you're writing. And for me, my audience was myself. And I knew I couldn't really write about why Jack did what he did. And I couldn't really write about my other family members without feeling like I was writing a story that was not mine to tell. They get to write their own stories about how they felt. So I knew I was writing my own story for me. And as I went along, I thought, well, maybe this will help other people who are going through this kind of deep, deep grief. And so each essay is just about whatever I was thinking about at that moment. And it could have been something as seemingly ridiculous as creating what I called rage crafts, which was knitting where the tension was way too tight, or doing needlepoint and it was way too tight. It was a way that I always showed my rage and my grief through these little craft pieces that I was trying to create to be lovely little Christmas gifts. Well, big fail on my part. But it really told me something about what I was going through. And I also realized I had to kind of interrogate my background a little bit more. So writing more about what it was like to grow up on a farm and my family, what they were like, what my expectations became. But if someone is in the middle of deep grief, this is how they think. It's not logical. It's not linear.
Mhm.
It's just things happen.
Yeah. So we're gonna continue the conversation, Rachel, and I think we've just started to touch on it. And anyone that's listening to us right now, I invite them to come over to Dad's Space. We're going to be recording that episode soon. How do people contact you, Rachel? How do people find you and interact with you?
Well, they can find me on Facebook, Rachel Dickinson, and they can find me on Instagram, where I believe I am Geology 26. And they can find me on Twitter, where I am Rachel Birds, but who knows how long Twitter will even be a thing.
Yeah.
Or they can email me, geology26@yahoo.com. I'm totally open to that.
Great. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then I love the idea that we're going to get together and talk more about Jack and your story, really inviting everybody to come over there, because that's going to be an amazing conversation. And I'm so thankful that you have time today to chat. And I'm really looking forward to having you back to continue that conversation.
Thank you, Dave. It's been a real honor to be on this.
Awesome. Everyone, please go check out all the information in the show notes. And like we mentioned, Rich is going to come back and we're going to talk further about her journey, her story. And again, so blessed to have you on. Thank you, Rachel, for your time.
Thank you.
Awesome. Well, the podcast is over. Thank you for being a part of this episode. If this is your very first episode, welcome to Living the Next Chapter. You can go back in our catalog. You can see some of the past episodes. But if you want to get a sneak peek of what's coming, you want to jump the line? I got something for you. Go to our YouTube channel. Again, links are in the show notes and on our website, livingthenextchapter.com, and you can go to our YouTube channel and get the most recent episode way before everybody else. So we're putting this at the end of the podcast because we don't want to tell everyone. We don't want to have a stampede, but we're having some great conversations over on our YouTube channel. You're invited. You've been here this far. You're the one listening. You are invited to our YouTube channel. Go over there and you can see the most up-to-date episodes in real time. Meet you over there. Thanks for listening. Cheers.
Mindshift Power Podcast, the podcast for teenagers and those who work with them. There's a huge problem in America today. There's a very large disconnect between teenagers and the adults who work with them. I'm looking to bridge that gap with real, raw, honest conversation, not held back by the chains of political correctness. You cannot solve a problem you do not understand. Want to understand teenagers today? Listen to this podcast. This podcast is for teens in the U.S. and Canada. To learn more, go to fatimabay.com/podcast or just look for Mindshift Power Podcast on any listening platform. I look forward to you being a faithful listener.